in Williamsburg, Kentucky, on August 23rd, 1897. Less than a day after a verdict was handed down, a mob, 50 strong, orchestrated an act of retribution. Under the cloak of darkness, they approached the jail, knocked on the door, and they informed the deputy jailer Brummett they had a prisoner. Armed with nothing more than a candle to light his path, when he opened the door, the mob rushed him, and they took control of Sullivan on a day that would become known as a bloody Sabbath.
I've been down and I've been out. I almost drank myself to death. I done some wrong, I done some right. Yeah, I am guilty of regret. Smoke some weed.
The town of Williamsburg, Kentucky, it's nestled in beside the Cumberland River, bordering Tennessee. There lived a breed of folks that was molded by the hardy spirit of the Appalachian people, and they were a proud people who felt a deep responsibility for community and justice. However, an unsettling event shook this close-knit community in late summer of 1897. In court proceedings, Candy Sullivan was accused of assaulting his sister-in-law in a degrading way. And on top of that, he was accused of beating her on the head and her body so bad that her life was in great despair. The father of Sarah, the victim in this case, testified, and he said they had been agreed that Sullivan should plead guilty and get 20 years in the pen. And when the verdict was handed down Saturday at about noon, it created an uproar, as it was generally believed that Sullivan would get the penalty of the law, death. A large crowd of town folks had gathered around, and that afternoon, whispers and mutters could be heard in the street corners and the hotels, and it was no secret that the town was in disagreement to the verdict. County officials had no idea that this unrest would manifest itself into a mob, and that it would eventually lead up to the lynching of Candy Sullivan. The county judge and the circuit judge, as well as the Commonwealth's attorney, had a strong feeling that after the first indication was over, that the folks would go on about their way, and that they'd let the law run its course and do its job, and that there'd be no threats of violence against Sullivan, and they didn't believe that they needed any extra guard of any kind or any protection from violence toward Sullivan. But somewhere in the town, or out in the county, there was someone who was putting together a gang to ride in and go in and get Sullivan and bring to him what they felt was coming to him, right or wrong. And this is what took place on August 23rd, 1897, at about 1 o'clock Sunday morning. A mob of about 50 men went to the jail, and they knocked on the door. And they informed Deputy Brummett, the jailer on duty that night, that they had a prisoner. And when Brummett opened the door, with nothing more than a candle in his hand, they overpowered him. and they made a mad rush toward the cell that held Canty Sullivan, who was convicted just that day of assaulting his sister-in-law. Sullivan pleaded with the mob to spare his life and just let him serve out his sentence, but they answered him by throwing a rope around his neck and pulled it tight, and they drug him from his cell. Another man by the name of James Reedy was also in jail with Sullivan, and he had just received 21 years for killing another man, but he escaped notice from the mob, even though that he had grown close to Sullivan. Somewhere during all this, Sullivan seemed to realize that his time had come, and he asked the mob to let him walk to the place of his execution and not to choke him anymore. And they did give him this one last wish. The noose was loosened, but it was still kept around his neck. He was led to the bridge that crossed over the Cumberland River, just about 800 yards from the jail. Now, whenever they got to the bridge, the loose end of the rope was thrown over one of the overhead beams, and Sullivan was jerked until his feet was nearly about a foot from the floor, and he was left to hang there and choke. For about 2 hours, the mob guarded each end of the bridge, refusing to allow anyone to approach it. At about 7 o'clock Sunday morning, the coroner cut down the body, and he held an inquest. The verdict of the jury being that Sullivan came to his death at the hands of persons unknown. The mob, they worked quietly, so quietly that the people living next door to the jail knew nothing about it until they awoke Sunday morning. Not one shot was fired, and no loud talking was indulged in. This Sunday will become known as a Bloody Sabbath for all the bloodshed that happened throughout Kentucky on this day. The newspapers read, "A Bloody Sabbath. 3 men are dead, 1 left dying. Sullivan lynched in Williamsburg."
This story is a moment in the history of Williamsburg, where the bounds of law and justice were tested. The actions of the mob that fateful Sunday morning remain a reminder of the depth of shared bonds, their commitment to justice, and the lengths they were willing to go to when they felt the law had failed them.
Trying to live this outlaw life. I lost my friends and lost my wife. The whiskey cut just like a knife.